Good morning and welcome back to Spit YouTube. Today I'm going to be talking about Deep Rock Galactic. It's a game I've only gotten into semi-recently, especially compared to other games I expect to be doing these some thoughts on videos in the future. However, this game has given me a lot to think about, especially with reference to the stark difference in how I seem to consume the game versus others, which will be a major theme of the thoughts in this video. There'll also be a fair couple of comparisons to a couple of other games, and finally I'll be mentioning some things I particularly like about the game. Thought number 1, the strategy of Deep Rock Galactic. I've seen well over a dozen DRG review videos on YouTube at this point. Maybe a review isn't the right word, most of them are basically well-edited gush pieces about many beloved aspects of DRG, be it community, the amazing dev team, or that there's a button on your keyboard that makes your character say rock and stone. I get why people gravitate towards this for their DRG reflection videos. It doesn't surprise me that things like class variation, game progression death, random cave generation, character customization, both in weapons and in cosmetics, music, community vibes, and the rock and stone button are all constantly brought up when making a reflective video on Deep Rock Galactic. I should mention that I echo these statements. I like these aspects as well, and I'll eventually get to them. But there's this major disconnect I have when I watch these videos. They all miss, or at the very least seem not to emphasize enough or even at all, the very fulfilling strategy elements of the gameplay, which is what glued me to the game upon my first couple of plays. A core memory I have of Deep Rock Galactic regards the engineer. If you played any shooter game, you already know what the engineer does. He builds turrets. It's like this in TF2, Risk of Rain 2, and I'm sure it's the same in Overwatch 2 too, although I'm not too familiar with that game. The engineer from Deep Rock Galactic, Unnumbered, features two main unique mechanics: the ability to construct and relocate turrets, as per expectation, as well as a platform gun, which is a gun that creates platforms upon firing. There's very obvious simple use cases of the platform gun. You can get up high ledges by building a platform halfway up the ledge, or if the ledge is tall or you need to scale a wall, you can construct a staircase. Then you realize that you can also cross valleys by making bridges, or perhaps you can extend out some thin platforms. Eventually you realize that you can reshape almost any environment to your liking. Rooms with massive pillars can become playgrounds of your own understanding. Upon valleys can rest your personal handmade battlements fitted with sentry guns. After a couple games, you get the ability to upgrade your platforms with both fall damage reduction as well as reducing enemies' willingness to walk on them. I remember realizing this early on into my DRG gameplay. I started DRG by playing the engineer, and this method of viewing a shooter game, both in terms of combat strategy and ease of movement strategy, was really quite rewarding. It's this feeling that initially got me hooked into DRG above and beyond all other aspects. Now, I'm not all that well versed in the shooter genre. The only shooter games I consider myself experienced in at all are Team Fortress 2 and Risk of Rain 2. I have a couple of hours in both of them, just like in DRG, and I want to draw some comparisons between TF2 and Deep Rock Galactic for a bit, just to frame what I mean by DRG strategy elements. But before I do, I want to make the quick note that obviously people don't just play these games for their strategy alone. TF2 for most people isn't a game about planning and winning, and many people play TF2, Raw 2, and DRG for simple fun. The claims I'm going to make I hope are not misconstrued as me saying, here is how fun is made for all players when they play these games. My intention is more along the lines of here are how the strategy elements of these games can be felt and what gameplay elements of these games lead to these feelings. The first and most obvious difference in these games is mapping. Team Fortress 2 uses the same maps every time. Every game of PL Barn Blitz or PL Upward has the same physical structure as the next game of PL Barn Blitz or PL Upward. This is also the case for Risk of Rain 2, by the way. Each map follows the same style with only minor variations which are easily remembered. DRG, conversely, is largely randomized based on a series of random generation principles. Patterns exist to some extent for mission types or biomes or mission complexity score, but the process of planning and thinking about a given environment does require you to play around the environment given, and it can differ wildly between missions. This change influences the way you approach setting up for a fight. Team Fortress 2 has generally agreed upon battlements and set up positions for each map. If I say the sentry spots on any payload map, for example PL Badwater, if you've played PL Badwater even just twice, you know exactly which spots I'm talking about. Especially for engineer characters, the locations for defense are blatant and ingrained. Now, there's decent logic for the spots on PL Badwater. Many of them come with certain degrees of cover, which is important as sentries in TF2 can take damage, unlike DRG. Many of them are based on the ammo and health packs, where the rest of the team would like to hold as well. These spots can have their strength and strategy felt in two ways. One way is to spend time and energy analysing why these spots are good from a strategic lens, but a simpler and more common way is to merely do a modicum of background trial and error, following what others do successfully versus what spots get easily unrewarded, and not try too hard to work out the why. Both are viable strategies to discover and feel a success in Team Fortress 2. Deep Rock Galactic, however, with randomized maps, doesn't feature the idea of the sentry spot on upward. If you want to feel as if your sentry is doing a strong, powerful thing, you'll need to analyze the terrain and understand the logic behind good and bad terrain and what the point of a sentry is way more analytically. Both TF2 and DRG actually share very similar sentry logic. Sentries ought not to be the primary fire for a team, but to be used as secondary fire, at least generally speaking. They create defensive zones to deal with solitary, overzealous enemies and create safe fallback zones for teammates. They used to secure areas of a map if certain zones are trying to be maintained. High ground's preferable to low ground, you want them to be looking in the right direction. Obviously there are some differences, the main one being that, again, DRG sentries are invincible and untargetable, while TF2 sentries can be hurt and destroyed, but these general principles are still relevant, and I think my main point here largely stands. I'm sure you can just plop down sentries in DRG and they'll get something done, but DRG definitely opened my eyes to a whole new world for me in having to think on my feet for what the best sentry spots would be in a given unknown cave. This managed to be combined with the platform gun, which gives you so much flexibility to be creative with your defensive strongholds. I'm not attempting to imply that one can't be creative with defenses or offenses in TF2, but there's a stark difference, in my opinion, of the feeling of strategy both games implicitly create via their systems. Engineer characters aren't the only ones for whom strategy is relevant, although I do think strategy is emphasized most strongly in those characters, and they happen to be my favorite in both games. The TF2 soldier has typical defensive holds and is important for both primary damage and for sieging defensive systems. The demo man denies certain traversal paths via stickies. The spy, theoretically, excels at taking out the backline. DRG's driller thrives in enclosed environments where all the enemies have to walk into his firewall, or at least with how I play him. The scout speeds around trying to hit enemies' weak spots, so the primary fire of the team has less that they need to focus on. You don't even know if I'm talking about DRG or TF2 with that one. To summarize thought 1, as it's a bit of a long one, DRG grabbed me not with the dwarves or mining or bugs or whatever. The advertising for DRG actually made me largely disinterested in the game. What glued me to it, and a main reason as to why I play it so much, is the immense satisfaction I get from the feeling of having to learn and then implement adaptive strategies. Another way of viewing what I've said is to make a very simple comparison. TF2's randomization, variation might be a better word, but anyway. TF2's randomization, when it comes to planning for a round or a fight, comes from the uncertainty you have in the enemy skill and team comp and your teammate skill and team comp. The locations and logic of the strategies you employ will be largely the same in a macro sense, even if in a micro sense they're wildly different. DRG's randomization, or again, variation, when it comes to planning for a round or a fight, comes from the uncertainty you have in the environment in which you'll be fighting. Sometimes there are unique enemies, although many swarms are pretty similar, but the gameplay will be most effective if you incorporate the logic of the environment strongly. The prioritization is on the environment, which is so cool. This feeling is quite apparent to me, but I can't be certain if this is something that other people share or if it's just me. There could be other explanations for my connection of this idea to DRG, of course. I started playing TF2 at 12 years of age or something, while I started playing DRG at 21 years of age. Maybe I'm simply more analytical nowadays. Maybe it's because DRG has less players per lobby and is PvE as opposed to PvP. Whatever. Nonetheless, the feeling I've given for this strong feeling of fulfillment from strategy participated in and rewarded for seems to track for me philosophically. Thought number 2. The cave is my new home. The strategy element of DRG was the main thing that grabbed me. Many games have strong feelings of strategy though. In fact, it's a common theme among many of my beloved games. There's another critical piece of the puzzle that fills my heart for why DRG feels so special to me, and I don't see this point in any of the DRG review videos either. Whenever I play through a game of DRG, I get quite attached to my cave. I've built and prepared for zones where I can excel in combat. I've completed objectives at specific locations. I've traversed and mined through caves. And by the end, most missions ask you to walk back through all the memories and experiences you've made in the cave. There's a pretty strong feeling I get by a mission's completion, where I feel like I've made the cave my own. I've added my own platforms, I've drilled my own holes, I've discovered my own generalized grappling hook dodging patterns, such that I've converted a great unknown of a cave to a very comfortable known. As I walk back to the drop pod, I can look back at the cave, I can see all the setups I've made, all the explosions that have occurred in the walls, where I spent most of my time dodging and beating enemies. I feel as if it was my home for a good 30 minutes to an hour. I haven't found another game that was able to give me such a strong feeling in this specific kind of way. For a good chunk of my life, I primarily played roguelikes, and many times in those games, it feels like you're progressing through a path with no reason to give any mental energy to the idea of the run as a whole. Slay the Spire, Isaac, Risk of Rain 2, One Step from Eden, FTL, etc. Once you go to the next floor, lets you forget everything prior and just focus on the now and planning for the future. Hell, once you push past a point in TF2 even, that point is basically irrelevant for the rest of the game, at least in the modes I frequent, like Payload. The closest I've gotten to this feeling for any other game was playing Tears of the Kingdom, which was the first game I'd ever played where I felt like my experience was so uniquely my own, and that I've imprinted my own gameplay and mindset into the game. Most other games feel as if I'm participating on logicking my way through their systems, say, logicking through the combat and binding of Isaac, but both Tears of the Kingdom and Deep Rock Galactic make me feel like I'm converting the game into a SPIDS experience. Maybe I'm just sentimental about my cave systems. It may not surprise you that on-site refining, the mission with the most personalization and cave structuring, is my favorite mission type by far, and I genuinely still remember a good 4 to 5 of those cave systems. I remember exactly how I set up, how I prepared for every fight, and how I built those pipes. It felt so idiosyncratic and personalized, which seems so strange to me for a shooter game. And it isn't the shooting or the strength of my build that makes a run so memorable and unique, like it might be for Risk of Rain 2. It genuinely is just the cave itself. It feels like Deep Rock Galactic so strongly emphasizes the environment, especially with the deep feeling of strategy that I get from Thought 1, that it's a core part of what is lovable about Deep Rock Galactic to me. But maybe this is just a me thing though. At the end of the day, these first 2 thoughts are about feelings I have about DRG. I just hope there's someone out there that sees Deep Rock Galactic the same way that I do. Thought number 3, can't see shit in Hoxxes. My favorite class in DRG is the Engineer, as I've explained. You might assume that the second favorite spot would go to the other terrain manipulation focused class in the Driller, but you'd be dead wrong. The Scout is by far my second favorite class in DRG. There's the very obvious and simple reason that he's a speedy guy, and being speedy is generally enjoyable in games. Grappling hooks are fun, and his weapons are all cool and stuff, but the flare gun is where he really shines. Scout is the only class to have a strong method of lighting up an area. Every class has flares, but flareless vision is really quite minimal, and flares can be finicky and have too long a respawn time to satiate my needs of vision. The only other lighting method that isn't flares that I'm aware of at least is the engineer's turrets, which have their own lights. Anyway, all I wanted to say here is that Hoxxes is dark, and darkness is a very weird mechanic to me. Obviously in DRG, light as a game design feature is used for many things, such as theming, class balance, class synergy, cooperativization. By cooperativization, I just mean classes having unique team play elements forcing cooperation, the famous example being engineer platforms plus the scout grappling hook. But in most games that play with darkness, either makes it a thing to be resolved with permanent solutions, say torches in Minecraft, or it's a story game or something where the lights are off for story reasons, like for example some scenes in Phoenix Wright Trials and Tribulations. At least with the games I play, I'm sure in like horror games it's used for a certain effect or whatever. However, the gameplay practicalities of this is that I'm always constantly aware of my flare count, sometimes just waiting 10 seconds for a flare to recharge so I can check if some silly final fossil is in a crevice at the top of Hollow Bow. Having to think about my flares or placing turrets as the engineer to get my lighting or the immense quality of life I get by simply playing the scout class is not something I'm certain of my opinions of. I don't know if I find this mechanic fun and good or unfun and bad or some other permutation of these adjectives. I don't know if I'd remove darkness as a gameplay feature in my ideal version of a DRG-esque game, but I definitely wouldn't say it's something I'd like about playing DRG, but also don't dislike it conceptually. Light and darkness in video games can be a pretty interesting thing to use as an analysis point. Eventually in the far, far future, instead of making game-focused videos, I might do themed-focused ones, and I think darkness could be something to talk about more, but my experience with the darkness in games is relatively limited. Thought number 4, Deep Rock Galactic's thematic elements. At the start of thought number 1, I mentioned what most people love and reflect on in Deep Rock Galactic. There's often a particular emphasis on the culture and theming of DRG. There are a lot of elements to this, and they all interlock into one cohesive experience. I want to talk about a bunch of disjointed things regarding the presentation of Deep Rock's aesthetic and theming. However, it's difficult to figure out where to start, so forgive me if the presentation here seems a little all over the place. There's a button in DRG, naturally binded to V, where your character yells out rock and stone, or something related to rock and stone. You can also press it when holding a beer to cheer someone. This button is pretty omnipresent in the way DRG is played with people. I haven't played many public lobbies, I'm not a big fan of them in general, but when I have, it's all about pressing the rock and stone button when you find something, when you kill something, when a funny moment happens, when a miner joins, when a mission starts, when the mission ends. It's a cool cultural element that is parroted in the community pretty constantly, be it the in-game community, the Reddit community, or the YouTube community in comments and videos. Relatedly to the first point I'm going to make here, the characters in DRG are also generally quite funny. There's a lot of dialogue I really like in this game. Some specific favorites are the retail store bit, which makes me chuckle every single time I hear it, as well as the, legally speaking, rocking is more legal than stoning, both of which are just grand. I think the humor and personality of DRG as a game, like with the rock and stone button and the character interactions and dialogue, is a pretty big part of why it's beloved. It definitely adds more than it detracts. This is also a case for a bunch of other games, most notably for me is TF2 again, another game with great personality. Despite personality not being an extension of the main idea of the game, I think it's pretty important when talking about how people perceive their experiences with Deep Rock Galactic. I don't know the best way to articulate this point, and it's a really minor point when fully fleshed out, but I want to say something along the lines of this. If DRG did not have the culture and characterization it had, I personally would probably get the main enjoyment I get out of it just as much. This statement is largely said contrastively to a lot of the perspectives and culture that seem to surround this game, which is to articulate somewhat that the rock and stone button is a deeply critical thing for their enjoyment. This is very fine, it's definitely a good thing, this simple V key does so much for so many people. I definitely prefer its inclusion and culture than not having it, both for others' enjoyment and my own, but DRG is definitely not primarily the rock and stone game to me, and I don't necessarily get too much out of presenting DRG this way. The other major cultural element I want to touch on is the hub world. DRG had a free weekend or something recently, so a friend of mine I'd gushed to about DRG and streamed it to finally had a chance to play it for himself, and he mentioned how he quite liked the DRG hub world.
This stuff is very cute though. I'll admit that.
Hub worlds are interesting, and like lighting, I think I'd like to eventually make a whole thing about hub worlds. DRG's hub world isn't mandatory. In fact, no hub world is mandatory because nothing about video games is mandatory. DRG's hub world adds greatly in creating the culture and environment that is obviously desired as part of the DRG experience, and I think most games with a hub world are generally improved by having it. But I think there are definitely worlds where there's no hub world and there's just menus for everything though, kind of like how Risk of Rain does ability changes and character selections, and I'm pretty glad DRG didn't go for that. To summarize, as this thought was a little jumpy, there are many elements of DRG's theming and presentation that have contributed to building up a certain type of culture, such as the rock and stone button, the character's personality, and the space rig. For many people, this congregation of ideas is built up to create an aspect that they love greatly about DRG, which is based, and I'm happy people can get so much out of it. I think it's very reasonable to say DRG with these cultural and thematic elements is much better than DRG without these cultural and thematic elements. The only perspective I wanted to share was that in my opinion and experience, I think I get slightly less out of this than a lot of others seem to. The role-playing by typing rock and stone in YouTube comments or Reddit is a much less of what I love about the game compared to the strategy. I personally find when it comes to reviews, reflections, and discussions, the percentage of the game I prioritize and the percentage of the games that others seem to prioritize just don't seem to line up. All of this is totally fine for what it's worth. I hope I'm not misconstrued as saying I dislike these elements. There's just this disparity here that I wanted to try and get to. Thought number 5, short responses to other DRG videos. As I mentioned, I've seen a lot of other DRG reflection videos. I wanted to highlight 2 that I thought were unique compared to the crowd and presented something particularly interesting, especially more than being just merely gush pieces. Not to besmirch the good name of a solid gush piece, I thoroughly enjoy listening to people gush about things I like too. The main points in these videos would have been thoughts in this video on their own, if not so wonderfully put by others. The first is this video by Engel, entitled The Cult-Like Fanbase of DRG. It took me a while to watch this, as to be honest, the title of the video and the thumbnail presents itself as something very different from what the video is actually about, or at least what I got out of it. I really recommend watching this video. It's quite good and I relate to the main point of it incredibly strongly. Angel, or maybe Engel, I don't actually know, makes this point about the difference in the experience of Deep Rock Galactic with friends versus Deep Rock Galactic alone. DRG is primarily a co-op game, and many people describe either the experience with friends or the experience with randoms to be the best and main way to play. Angel talks about his experience of being introduced to DRG via his friends, and how that made him largely disinterested in DRG as DRG, and only let DRG be a background piece for him to interact with his friends. It was only through solo play that he discovered the enjoyment of the game itself, and that made him actually able to enjoy Deep Rock as a unique experience, and then he was able to use that to re-enjoy Deep Rock Galactic with his friends. Engel makes this point much better, much more clearly, and more importantly with way more humour than I used, but I was so happy to see someone else eloquently explain this opinion I've had. I felt this in DRG less so compared to other games, but it's still quite a strong feeling I've had with a myriad of other co-op experiences, especially Terraria and Stardew Valley. Both are games I think I had subpar initial experiences with compared to what they ought to have been due to the initialization of my time with those games being through co-op as opposed to solo. Don't get me wrong, I love my friends just as Engel loves theirs presumably. I'm going to make that assumption, I hope it's a relatively safe assumption. But when you're with your friends experiencing something, a lot of your mental energy often goes to enjoying your friends and not to immersing and valuing the game itself. It's obviously different for different games and different with different friends and different for different people, but I really wanted to highlight this point. It's something I think about a lot when I reflect on why I like or dislike games. Is it the game itself or just how I was introduced to it? Again, I really highly recommend checking this video out. Link to this video and the next one are in the description. Thank you Engel or Angel for making that video. I really quite enjoyed it, both in the themes presented and the jokes, and especially the grass analogy that is introduced at the start. The other video I want to mention in Thought 5 is by Snis. Snis makes very calming, relaxing videos about a myriad of topics in Deep Rock Galactic. If you're a DRG fan and you don't know Snis, I recommend putting some Snis on. There's a bunch of stuff there that's mostly all reflections, which if you're this far through a Spids YouTube, you're going to enjoy Snis. Snis has a video from before Season 5 entitled DRG, Seasons Need to Evolve. It's quite a good video that perfectly describes how the season system works, what makes it great, and some notable setbacks that has it from feeling fully fulfilling. The latter third of the video is dedicated towards a theoretical solution that Snis does say may not be the best, and I too am not sold by it, but I find this video very interesting from a game design perspective and from a DRG player perspective. Season missions are an element of game design I've not given much thought to, despite being pretty present in many modern live service games, even ones I've put multiple thousands of hours into, like Legends of Runeterra and Brawl Stars. And this video opened my eyes up to that. I really recommend checking this out from a game design perspective and a DRG perspective. Thanks to Snis for not only making that video, but the tens of others of videos about DRG. You've got a lovely calming voice and a great presentation style. Thought number 6, general mission type thoughts. The final thought of this video is just going to be me doing the gushing thing about some things I love about this game. You can't escape it in a DRG video. There's just so much to say and so much to gush about. I'm going to do this by talking about the mission types via the format of a tier list. I'm an unironic enjoyer of a good solid tier list, hence why I've chosen it. As I mentioned before, by far my favorite mission type is on-site refining. The cave generation is always super cool, and I love the inherent necessity for terrain manipulation for the objective, not just for combat and mining. If DRG was nothing but on-site refining, I think I'd probably rate it just as highly. Just under that is escort duty. Before Season 5, this actually used to be my least favorite mission type by a long shot. I find extracting the oil shales to be a pretty boring experience in general, and this back and forth of moving forward 2 rooms with the drill and clearing both rooms when it stops feels awkward and somewhat unfulfilling. It's not bad, but it doesn't spark a whole lot of joy. And then the final room with the Armor and Heartstone, while sounding like a cool boss fight with the waves, rocks, and lasers in the same order, isn't bad, it just wasn't as enriching as the other gameplay DRG offered. The scout is very fun. Being able to grappling hook to the top of the laser beams and power attack them to instantly nullify them is a really fun gameplay experience, and I always enjoyed the engineer. But it's the sort of event where, in a team setting, you end up getting into what feels like rather monotonous roles. The final fight to me is actually way more fun of an experience solo rather than with a full team. And duo is a decent enough experience, but I still prefer solo for it. Anyway, after Season 5 came out, they added a new phase to the Hearthstone. Not only the inter-swarm phase is randomized, making it feel a lot more fresh with every subsequent playthrough, but the new phase adds terrain manipulation. For some reason, the Omra and Hearthstone room largely always looks the same, and you can always set up in exactly the same way. And this simple change does wonders for variation and for my enjoyment, which is largely expressed and felt through the changes in cave generation. This simple change has skyrocketed my perception of this event. Perhaps also because I'm writing this like a week after playing the new update, so it's all very exciting and new to me. This is an ordered tier list, and next up is Industrial Sabotage. I find this mission type deeply fulfilling. The cave generation being 3 large tunnels connected to a central chamber, 1 tunnel spawns you in and 2 tunnels for the force field generators, always feels super nice. The hacking pods for the force field generators have my favorite connection minigame besides the pipelines and on-site refining. The throwing of the orbs and making it line up feels incredibly fun, especially compared to the extremely simple rock cracker pod linking or the salvage operation battery linking. Protecting Hoxxes is enjoyable, and the final boss is quite a fulfilling experience. It feels to me that every class has a unique way of using their kit to deal with the questions the boss asks, both for solo play and for team play, especially compared to the Omra and Hearthstone boss, which doesn't feel as if it's asking as unique of questions. I have a pretty core memory of my first solo Hazard 5 win against the Pyramid. I was a driller, probably level 12 or something. I rationed out the driller's very toolboxy kit to min-max all of my resources. 1 flamethrower magazine per appendage, then pistol shots for the corners of the pyramid, followed by axes and pistol shots for the eye. Halfway through this experience is when I learnt that a single pickaxe power attack on an appendage instantly kills it, which is really easy to land right after it lunges, which meant then I could reallocate my flamethrower resources to eye killing and shredder shredding. I used every last dollop of nitro I could find and every last quarter of resupply and felt like I was using every single element of my kit effectively and strategically. Except for C4, and I couldn't find a good use for it, and it was only while writing the script that I learned of putting the C4 above the pyramid's top to explode the corners from a random Reddit thread. Learning this made me a little sad because I felt very rewarded by the methodology I had discovered on my own, and I find this method to be a little cringe and I probably won't do it, but it's interesting to know. Right after that is the new Deep Scan mission type. Simply put, as I've said a couple of times now, I'm in love with the cave generation for these ones. It's open, cavey, and thoroughly fulfilling to explore. Again, perhaps it's the newness bias, but it's basically exactly what I wanted from a new mission type. The drill elevator section is cool, although I think my favorite bit of the drill elevator, as silly as it sounds, is the fact that you can repair the things that overheat midway through the drilling. It took about 15 playthroughs of the big meteor event before I learned you could do that with the rock cracking pods, and it turned that random event into my favorite random event very, very easily. And it feels very fulfilling for that to be the case for the drill elevator. It's a decently cool idea to be shooting up as well. Feels novel, and novelty goes a long way. Elimination is next up. Elimination is fine. It's a good time, it definitely creates fun moments like a lot of the unique event type missions. But I do feel a little underwhelmed at the existence of only 3 bosses. I don't mean to complain, 3 bosses is way more than 1, which one could totally imagine being enough for games like DRG. But I think it's one of the few elements of the game that feels as if it's not as varied as the rest of the game. There's like a million overclocks, 6 weapons per character with a million upgrades each, drastically random cave generation, a bunch of different enemies, and what feels like 20 or so random events that can appear in missions, like unique bosses or jetty boot crates or whatever, but there's only 3 Dreadnought bosses. It feels like the Omra and Hearthstone has more variance than an elimination mission. This complaint may seem a bit excessive or even unappreciative. The game is amazing in so many ways. It seems like such a small thing to get hung up on, so I want to be as clear as I can with this. To me, this is just like how SNIS describes his criticism of the Season Pass. It's a pretty amazing system, especially compared to other games, but there's this very minor aspect of it that feels like it's lesser than the crazy dense amount of stuff that DRG has in every other element of the game. Still, the 3 bosses that are there are generally decent fun, and I have a great time with these missions. To cap off the A tier, I've got Point Extraction. Point Extraction has definitely created the most tense moments of any mission that isn't a boss-themed mission or a surprise event, and I love it for that. The way it creates a central hub, not by trying to protect something, but by being the only place you can deposit and by having extra arms, is pretty fulfilling for me too. Every memory I have of this mission is lovely and fun, even if during Season 4 the Lithophage Outbreak Foam and Vacuum event thing sometimes made the time commitment a little bit too much. Salvage Operation, Mining Expedition, and Egg Hunt all exist at a slightly lower tier than the previous mission types. I don't dislike any of these. I find every mission in DRG extremely fun and fulfilling, but they do feel very samey to each other. But again, there's no complaints here. If these appear as something to do, then do them I will. Originally, I was also going to include a tier list of the different regions of Hoxxes, the different warning modifiers for missions, and the different secondary objectives, but I think it's largely unnecessary and a bit cumbersome. So all I'll say is that I bloody despise Festive Fleas and I love Apoca Blooms, and that low oxygen is such an incredibly, incredibly fun modifier. Conclusions. Deep Rock Galactic is both a pretty simple game and a very dense game. There's a lot of different elements to reflect on with the game, all of which have interesting game design implications and gameplay feel implications. The first 2 thoughts of this video were about some feelings DRG gave me that I feel like are somewhat unique to DRG. I also mentioned how unfulfilling it was to see neither of those thoughts represented in other DRG review videos. Thought number 3 was about the darkness in Deep Rock and my uncertainty around it as a design element. Thought number 4 was the culture and presentation of DRG, a strong aspect of a lot of what people talk about regarding the game, and my perspective on the zeitgeist thereof. Thought number 5 was shouting out some other videos that you should definitely check out about other topics I find quite fascinating and agreeable. And finally, thought number 6 just had me gushing about mission types and some memories I have. There are a lot more thoughts I have about Deep Rock Galactic. There's about 5 thoughts I cut from this script, an extended elaboration on darkness, some thoughts about overclocks and upgrades, some thoughts about cheese strategies, my issues with the structure of deep dives, and how DRG is kind of built to create memories. Maybe many months down the line I'll make a second video following up on some of these. Finally, one quick fire thing before the video ends. Thank you so much for the response to the Some Thoughts on Slay the Spy video 2 weeks ago. It was a new format that I've had in my head for some time now, and I was beaming to see it responded to so positively. And especially a massive thank you to everyone who commented. I got a lot of the perspectives and thought presented as either alternate presentations of agreement or well-argued disagreement towards the point I made. It's kind of exactly what I wanted the comments to be like, and I so deeply appreciate it. I don't expect all of my Some Thoughts on videos to get as much traction as the Slay the Spy video, but I had a grand time making it, and I'm glad it seemed to be enjoyable. Anyway, that's all from me. The next video will probably be on another roguelike. I think a pattern of alternating between a roguelike and non-roguelike is a pretty comfortable rhythm for me. Alright, see you later, alligators.